So this presentation, last year I did a presentation on reaching deep, which was shipwrecks off of Cape May and all the boat captains and people that found and discovered wrecks and different artifacts and things like that. Tonight, this is a little bit further north. This is mainly out of Point Pleasant, Brielle, and we're going to be talking about some of the legends that actually went before us so that we could do what we're doing today. And I hope I get the right button here. So it's a little introspective. I'm going to tell you about my experience and how I got involved in this. I started diving down in Maryland, and I was really excited. My parents were going to move in the early 70s, and they asked me where I wanted to move, and I said New Jersey. They wanted to go to Florida, but I talked them into going to New Jersey, and I met up with this fellow named Norman Lichtman, and he had a company called Aquatic Recreational Enterprises with another fellow named Fred Newman. And I went to a class in Margate and stood in front of him, and he gave me the third degree and asked me where I came from. I jumped in the pool and started swimming, and we became really good friends. And then later on in life, we became partners. His NOWI number is 2825. That's how many instructors there were in the world at that time. So pretty impressive guy. He created an industry in New Jersey where he ended up having 4 or 5 shops. He actually purchased Deb Whitcraft's shop later on and turned it into one of the most successful businesses for diving in the United States. And then he decided to sponsor me as an instructor. So in 1974, instead of going to my high school graduation, I went and took an instructor's course. I passed, but I was only 17, so I was too young to teach scuba. I had to wait 2 years in order to do that. And Norman signed all my certification cards for 2 years. But this is the opening of a dive shop that I started with him in Ocean City, New Jersey, 746 West Avenue. And I might even remember the number, but I'm not going to try. The dive shop evolved. There's a lot of people that went on and created dive shops. Jim Framby, Steve Martin, and there's Norman. And there's a whole bunch of other people. Harley Sager in there, Rich Honesty. And Jeff Graham, Don Stone, who actually, with Diane Lichtman, ended up buying Triton Divers. No, Russ isn't in that picture. That's too early. But, and then I opened up after teaching school for a while. I decided that I wanted to get back into scuba. And Norman talked me into opening a dive shop. In 1986, I opened Atlantic Divers. And for our grand opening, we brought the bell from the Andrea Doria there. It was pretty exciting. And that's our first logo, which evolved. And now in 2019, Pete Bartow and Christy Bartow, they purchased Atlantic Divers from me, and I got out of it. So I am a manager now for this shop, and it's under Outfitters name, and we're making a presence in Cape May, and we have a couple boats down there, and we do charter boats on the coast. We do about 100 dives a year, and we travel all over. So Atlantic Divers sold its name, so this coming year, it'll be 40 years that we've been in business. This will be my 50th year of teaching scuba, and it's been an adventure the whole way. But also, someone who also influenced me and pulled me out of a few jams in the past. I can remember one specific instance where I drove to a dive and someone else packed the van for me. When I got there, at the time, no one wore stabilizing jackets. They weren't even invented yet. They wore horse collar BCs and backpacks and tanks. And when I got to the dive, I emptied out all the tanks, gave them to everybody out, and somebody came back and they said, "Where's my backpack?" And there were no backpacks in the truck. And here I am in Barnegat Light, and I said, "Gee, I'm going to ask somebody a favor." I drove all the way down to Triton Divers, and I asked Deb, and she said, "For you and only for you would I give you these backpacks." She's also a Hall of Fame, Women's Hall of Fame in 2011, and we're glad to have her presence in this industry because she's made what we do today special and so well received. Did a couple of these presentations with her and for her because she's such a great person to be with. But now for the real presentation. This is Reaching Deep. With Norman, I ended up going out on a dive, and I hooked up with a guy by accident, and I ended up chartering his boat and mating on his boat and diving with him for 20 plus years. He became a really close friend, and really excited about this experience. Pretty much a mentor for me. This is a sea lion. There was no other boat like this boat. When you went out in the ocean, everybody recognized it. It sat in this beautiful marina with all these prestigious Bertrams around it, and this Popeye-like boat pulled out of the slip every morning, and a gang full of pirates and motorcycle gang guys got on this boat and took off and went scuba diving. In the early 70s, after Vietnam, people wanted to do something. So they wanted to have some exhilarating experience. It was either getting on a Harley and driving cross country, or they ended up with us and went scuba diving. And yes, that's snow on the dock in the early morning. We did lots of winter dives throughout the year. You're going to see some people that are no longer with us, but there's a lot of people here in this group that can recognize these photos and have been a part of this. If you want to sit over here, you can see better. Okay. And like I said, it was like bikers. Everybody had their own special outfit, pretty much blue jean jackets and leather jackets, and black boots and high-rise brown boots. And it was a tough crowd. It was pretty exciting because actually we did a lot of deep diving because really there was no sport diving limit at the time. You just went diving and you got on the boat and you'd say, well, we're going to go out. And I remember on one of the schedules, the first dive of the year was the Aruca, which is the oil wreck, which is 170 feet. And that was in March. And we said, okay, we're going to go. We'll go out and we'll go diving. The boat had a lot of character, but not as much as the captain who ran the boat himself. He was a real character. George Magnus Hoffman, I should say, and I'll tell you about the role of Magnus in just a minute, had this special boat. He was the most qualified, gifted captain that you could ever go diving with. Most of the wrecks that we dive off of Point Pleasant, he was either the first one to dive or the first boat to go out and look for them. Down below inside the cabin, there was a little stove, oil stove, and the crew's job, each one had their own specific task. They get on the boat, they'd light up the stove to warm it up in the wintertime. Then everybody would go down below and they'd put like their food and their coffee and cans of soup on top of it. And unfortunately, a couple people didn't understand that when you put a can of soup and you only put one hole in it, it's going to heat up. And after about several different instances, the can would explode and hot tomato soup would shoot around the cabin. It was a learning experience for everybody. Here's some of the pirates. And this guy right here is Sean Malone. And in the darkness there, which you can't see, if we turn this light off, you might be able to see a little bit better. But there's Captain George Hoffman. There's Myrna, his wife, and one of his mates. That's Bill Hooterman. And the other are just charter fillers, customers, people that pay for our fun and enjoyment. This is what you wore when you went diving back then. Most people had a single tank, a BC horse collar, and a good old yellow Darrell Allen light, which weighed about 20 pounds, is actually added as your weight. It was good for hitting fish in the head or stopping an allmouth from trying to get attached itself to you. And you have a little depth gauge here, and that's it. You're set. Nothing is special there. A T-shirt that I made. This is Junk Divers, and there's a garbage can pouring a bunch of divers out into the ocean. I said to a guy one time as he was going into the water, he had a camera, 2 crowbars, chisels, hammers hanging from him. And I saw his scooter laying over in the corner. I said, "Hey, you forgot your scooter." And it was kind of a joke. And he's like, "Yeah." And he strapped that on and jumped into the water. So,
Is that better? No?
it's this light right here.
All right, I'll just keep pushing buttons till something happens.
You might recognize this guy. He owned a dive shop too. He went out diving with us. This is Jim Framby's here. Again, divers are down below. They're warming up for the dive, getting ready to go. And Captain George shows up always at 5:07 every single time because all his gear was on the boat, already ready to go. His band of other mates already had everything set for him for diving. He had a special stool that he sat on, and it was like the throne. Nobody touched it or got near it. One time we went out diving, and he kind of had a temper. And when he couldn't find a wreck, he would stomp his foot. And you could hear his foot stomping up and down when he was mad. And he went up to throw the anchor out, and a couple people got in his way. And he picked up a box and went to throw it overboard. And Gary Gentile said, "George, George, George, that's my camera." And he put the box back down. He went over, he cut loose the line, and the anchor went down and hooked into the wreck. But before that happened, this stool went flying out of the wheelhouse into the water and disappeared. And during the dive, I was swimming along down there, and there's a stool laying on the bottom. And I'm thinking, gee, I wonder if I brought this back up, if he would be mad at me. So I just left it sitting there on the bottom. We got a lot of lobster at those times. We went out and we do what we call a lobster loop. He would drop a weight down, and everyone would jump on the weight, 2 or 3 divers at a time, go down and shoot down to a little tiny wreck. And we loaded up with dozens of lobsters per trip. Myrna went out on all his trips when I first went there. And I think that she wanted to check up on him, make sure he was really going diving. So I can remember down there, and she'd be reading her book all day long, and she never came out until the end of the dive and collected the money and went back home. There was a little fish on a plaque down below, and it said Captain Nice. And the first time I met George, I was down below and I was walking up the steps, and I stumbled into him, and he had this big grin on his face and said, "Gee, it's a little smelly down there. I can see why you're rushing out and almost knocking me over." But he made light of it. And from then on out, I wanted to be a part of this crew. When you understand that something great is happening, you want to be a part of it. He made so many wreck discoveries. You can't even name all of them, but these are just a few of them, and then there's some more of them that add later on and on. But from the A-frame, the Galandris, the A-frame actually in the center up there was, we think, is the Brooklyn, which was a Navy ship that sailors would stay on and VM port in New York. We think that's what the A-frame or the across was. The Continent, the Chopa, the Galanders, the Balena. There's him with the bell from the Balena, and Catamount and Arundo. It was just goes on and on and on. He was the first one to all these. He had a little boat first, where he went out and did all these trips. But he also participated in charters and went out on big boats. And he told us lots of stories about those trips. Of course, they were long rides. The boat was slow. The boat did like 6 or 8 knots. So a trip to the Stolte Galley back then, which was had sank in 1964, which was only like 10 years before. When I first dove it, there was paint still on the wreck, which was pretty neat. Today it's shredded. It looks like lettuce on the bottom. You know, there's no paint. There's hardly any structure left. It's collapsing on top of itself. But everybody slept because it was always going to be 2 hours, 2 hours. When are we going to get there? 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours. I think I got very comfortable sleeping in my sleeping bag on the boat deck. But the first trip that I went to was the Stolte Galley, and it was an exciting day. This is the ship that cut it in half. It actually split in half, the Shalom. And look at the damage to the bow, but it still was able to maintain floating. And actually the bow of the Stolte Galley also floated and was put on another ship and kind of made a Frankenstein Stolte Galley or whatever kind of ship. And there it goes, cruising off. It was towed away. But here's George Hoffman. That's John Dudas, and there's Evelyn Dudas. And they're on a boat that ran out of New York and went all the way down south to find the Stolte Galley. And the way that they found it was from an oil slick on the water. Remember, Aileron back then was really just lining up some towers and trying to find a spot. It was, you know, you really had to be a technician. And before Sealeran came out, which actually gave you numbers and let you know that where you were going. So these guys that went out, they kind of tried to find wrecks, and sometimes they just steered around and found nothing. A guy had these secret plans to the ship, and he brought them on the boat, and he covered them, and he would look at and see what, you know, he was going to go dive and where he was going to dive inside the wreck. Of course, everybody's got to go in the water sometime or another. So when he went in the water, they pulled it out, and I actually have pictures of people's hands holding the plans to the Stolte Galley because we all wanted to see what they were. Nothing's secret on the boat when you go diving. I sat by this window every trip and listened to George talk to his mates and talk about what the dive was going to be. It's a picture of Harley Sager in my spot before I pushed him out of the way because I wanted to hear. But he was always inspiring. We went out and it was always, you know, a little bit lumpy, he would call it, or a little bit cold. But one of his favorite lines is, "This is just rough enough to keep the tourists on the beach." He had lots of great sayings. Some of them I can't tell you, but give me a couple beers and maybe I'll tell you later on. Some pretty exciting stuff. And remember, it's only half a wreck and it's still a big wreck to go dive. It's very popular today. I asked George one time when I was chartering, I got on the boat and he said, "Gene, where are we going today?" He had this really strong New York accent because he worked for Otis Elevators in New York, and he kept that accent throughout his whole life. And I said, "George, we're going to the Stolte Galley." And he walked away and I heard him say, another suck-ass dive on the Stolta galleys. So we went there so much, it was like a bus tour back and forth and back and forth. And he really didn't want to go there. He wanted to go do something different, which he did. But he was a great boat handler, and he really could magnify the wrecks. We had a trip to the Aruca, the oil wreck, and he asked me where I wanted to be. And that's a massive site. And I said, gee, I want to be up in the bow, George. I'd like to be right in the forward stack, if it's possible, the forward mast, I should say. So I went down to tie in, and he dropped the hook, and the mast inside those things is like 3 or 4 feet wide. And the anchor went right down the tube of the mast and was down inside the mast. I had to stand on top of the mast at like 100 feet and pull the chain up all the way out of it so I could hook it on top of the mast. He was really a technician. Of course, he had this little thing with his mates. When they got back at the dock at the end of a trip, he would pull out a scale and all the local people would come around and he would sell lobsters. So some of the mates got in first, and George would kind of wait and say, we're not really in the wreck yet, and there'd be a little bit of a stall. And then by the time his mates loaded up with lobster, he would cut us loose so we could go down and pick for ourselves. I kind of got wind of that. And I remember John Weir and I sat on the side of the boat, and I said, we're not going to let this Hooterman guy go in ahead of us. As soon as he goes in, I'm going to go in too. And we both went over the side. We were banned for diving with him for about an hour or two. He was pretty mad. But here comes Hooterman up the ladder. He had 3 fingers. He was fixing something in his door, and the ladder slipped and the doorway closed on his 2 center fingers. So he lost those 2 fingers and they were gone. And he just had these 3 fingers. So when a new diver would come on the boat, he would kind of like let him see that hand. And then he would say, yeah, lobster took those off. And that would scare the heck out of those guys. And those people would like not go for any lobsters. It was a really funny thing that he did there. But George said that he caught more lobsters by accident than most people catch in a lifetime on purpose. He was a vacuum cleaner when it came to catching lobster. So he had this box in the back of his boat, and he kept all his dive gear in it. And he used to go around and he'd say, I can do all my diving and everything I need is in this bug bag. And I would say, George, what's that big wooden box? And he'd, shut up, Peterson. Shut up, Peterson. But anyhow, this is, you might recognize, that's Dennis Bogan there. That's Pat Yannington. There's Carl Fenton, his mate forever. And I'm not sure who this guy is, but there's George. And this is about the wooden box. But here's another guy here that was on all those dives. These are pictures on the boat, just throwing some divers in there. You might recognize Bart Malone. That was Steve Ferkaliak before him. Nice flat day on the ocean. And there's George going into the water over the side. So he comes back up. He always knew how to put us in our place. I mean, I remember one time I brought up this brass spike, and I had it, and I was all excited about it. And he looked at it, and he said, that's really nice. He goes, that's really, really nice. He goes, it's something that if you saw it in the street, you might walk around it and scrape your feet. And it took me a little while to understand what he meant. It was a piece of whatever. But he always knew how to put us in our place. And he did catch big lobsters. And he would say, someday I'll take you to the land of the big lobsters. He sold his boat to Alpiatech, who continued to run it for another 10 years or so, another decade of diving. Pretty exciting there. We had some great trips with Al. He's since sold the boat. But first trip was a great memory, and I'll never forget. It was an exciting experience to be on that boat and to be a part of it for the next 5 or 6 years. I ended up mating for him and then chartering his boat for almost 20 years. And some more wrecks. He was known for just traveling. He did the first trip down to North Carolina, found the U-85, went up and was the first one to dive the bass, and they recovered a box inside the bass, and they were able to positively identify that wreck. He did one of the first trips on the Viking Starlight out to the Andrea Doria back in 1967 with John Dudas, and he was just on top of everything. He was very exciting to be around. You just wanted to be a part of that enthusiasm that he kept pushing and pushing on everyone. There's John Moyer here, standing in the parking lot, ready to go diving. We had lots of trips. I think there's Tom Fagan there. And it's Stevie Sheeran, who made it for him for a number of years. He found a Corvallis. Corvallis is an interesting wreck because we went out there, we dived it, and I was excited because George said, you go in and tie in with John Dudas. So John Dudas at that time was a legend in diving, and here I was put side by side to go in the water and tie in with John Dudas. So very exciting dive for me. We went down on this little tiny broken up wreck. There was hardly anything there. And the first thing I picked up was a steel porthole. And I was like, man, this is a really crappy wreck. And we found out the history of this wreck. They made a movie and they decided to blow this up as one of the scenes in the movie. I don't know if you can venture back on YouTube and find this thing, but when they blew it up, it scattered all over the ocean and they were done with the scene and they decided to start coming in, and the Coast Guard came out and made them clean up the whole mess before it became a hazard to navigation. The Catamount was a little tiny wreck that we dove out there in the middle of nowhere too, that George had found. We kind of think these were the wrecks. They're never positively identified, but they were in the location of where they should have sank. Gene Delabadia recovered the helm from it. We went back out the next week, and I found this cage light, and the cage light was attached to a giant piece of metal, and I couldn't get it off. So I told Carl Fenton, who was the mate, I said, take down another lift bag and just put it on that pipe that's attached to the cage light and see if you can get the cage light off. Well, Carl took a 200-pound bag down. He put it on the cage light with the pipe, and that didn't work. So he went back up and got another diver to come down with him. They put another 200-pound bag on it. And they sent up this gigantic piece of metal that covered the entire back of the boat. Everybody in the boat was not happy with me that day because they were covered with this black soot from trying to bang off this cage light, and they finally got it out. I still have the cage light. It was a 400-pound cage light. Here's Paul Whitaker, a little wreck that we did in the mud hole called the Catamount, which was loaded with a bunch of portholes up in the bow section. So a couple portholes came up. And this was an exciting dive for me. So I just started diving with George, and I became like a regular on the boat. He did these Monday trips, and John Moyer and I looked at his penciled-in schedule, and it said experienced divers. So John and I said, well, we're experienced divers, experienced enough to go on these trips. So we went out, and George went down and recovered this bell. And it was an exciting day. I got some really classic pictures of him raising the bells, 400-pound bell from the Maurice Tracy. This was probably one of George's most exciting wrecks. He had a heart attack, and while he was in the hospital, Dennis Bogan came to visit him, and he brought him a little book that his grandfather had. Now, Bogan has the boats out of Point Pleasant to Paramount, and he's been in the fishing industry for 100 years. So he said, my grandfather found some of these wrecks just by latitude and longitude and by the fish that were boiling on the surface. So you can imagine shipwrecks back then, they were so undived and unfished that the fish just boiled on the surface, and you could find a wreck just by going over top of that area. So he had this little wreck. So George and Dennis and Carl Fenton went out, and Jimmy Brown, and they had the Paramount, which is like 100-foot plus boat, and they anchored into this boat that's only about 70 or 80 feet long. And they went down, and Dennis, first thing he found was a cannon. There's a bronze cannon laying in the floor. So George went down with the line. They tied a line to it. They brought this brass cannon back up to the surface, and they said, this is a great wreck. We can't dive this in the summer. We can only dive this in the winter. So I got wind of it, and I said, George, can we go on this wreck you found? He goes, yeah, but we can only go there in January. So it ended up being called the January wreck. So January came, and the weather was bad, So we ended up wanting to go in February, and the weather was bad. It wasn't until the very end of February that we dove this wreck. And it was exciting. My first dive down there, I go to the stern section, and I'm fanning around in the stern section, and I see a couple of these things laying on the bottom. It's interesting to note that we found a piece of glass, and the glass said KINS, and Eric Gray, who did research on it, found out through his microfiles, this is not the internet days, he found out that this matched up with a pilot boat that went down off that area called the Perkins, the Anthony Perkins. So we figured this must be the Anthony Perkins. And we went back over and over again. Thursdays, me and just a couple other people on the boat went out, and we dredged this wreck. I found this deck grate after I found the coins, and the deck grate was laying on the bottom. Let me tell you about surface interval after you find gold. I didn't come up and show the coins to everybody because I wanted to kind of put them in my pocket. But I put them in my glove, and I put the glove on the box in the back of the boat, and the diver was getting ready to go in the water, and he took my glove and he threw it on the deck. And when he threw it on the deck, the coins bounced around, and everybody heard the noise, and then a gold coin kind of rolled out on the deck. And George came walking back like it was like ringing the bell. He came walking back, and he said, Peterson, what do you got, partner? And I said, so everybody knew I found gold, and my surface interval time was a lot of waiting because everybody was waiting for me. They were waiting for me to go in the water so that they could find out where I was going. So finally, everybody got tired and decided to set their own luck. They went down the anchor line, and sure enough, I decided about 20 minutes or so after they went in the water, I would go down and start my dive. As soon as I got to the bottom of the anchor line, there were a whole bunch of divers there waiting for me. So I swam out into the sand away from where everybody was, wherever the coins were. They were the opposite end of the wreck. And I started digging, and I find this deck grate. So I grabbed the deck grate, and I bring that back, and I put it on the anchor line. And then I swim back to that spot again, and I sift up all the dirt and sand and everything and throw it up in everybody's faces. And I swim to the far end of the wreck in the stern. And there's John Moyer right in my spot. And John Moyer has really bad vision. He actually, in his mask, he has like Coke bottle lenses inside his mask. And I look down and there's 2 gold coins laying right in front of him. And he's like, oblivious. So I went down and I shoved him as hard as I could off to the side. And I shoved the coins in my pocket. And then I gave him a rib and I showed the coin to him. And I don't think he still forgive me yet for that. But when we went back out, Norman decided that he wanted to have some of the gold. So this is me coming up the ladder here. We decided to go out and actually salvage this. We took an airlift, took a dredge. We dredged for a few days over and over again. And Norman finally did get a piece of gold. It was a Faber eraser, and it was made out of wood. And the gold lining that said Faber on it was written in gold. So, some other gold coins did come up. Joe Milligan found a couple gold coins, and a bunch of silver coins came up, which was exciting. But a whole bunch of other really neat artifacts came up over the years. So George got a phone call from Ray Edel, and he said a tugboat just sank off of Barnegat Light. It's too close to my home territory, and I don't want to take divers out there to it because I don't want to get a bad reputation. So George got wind of this, and he said, "Yeah, we're gonna go from Brielle all the way down to south of Barnegat Light, which is a big hike. I mean, it's a long ride." And he got on the boat, and he had one of the mates steer the boat, and we're going out the inlet, and he says, "Hey guys, we can go out and we can get a few portholes or maybe get lucky and catch some lobsters, or maybe we can do something a little illegal." And Rick Jason pipes in and he says, "I've been to jail, George. It's not that bad." So we went south of Barnegat Light and we dove this tugboat that went down. And it was pretty exciting. It was in about 45 feet of water. They stripped all my tools off of me and let me go in the water to tie in. And when I got down on top of the wreck, I saw this 8-man Avon raft that was still in place. And whoever decided to unlock it left one of the open locks on it. So I pulled off the open lock and I said, "This ought to really screw them up on the surface." And I pulled the cord of the raft, and I came floating back up to the surface. And George looked over the side and he said, "Peterson, you're spectacular." Well, John Moyer went down, and I told him I was going to go for the helm. Well, the wheelhouse was busted off because the Coast Guard had towed this boat, and it ripped off the wheelhouse. And that's why they didn't want anybody diving it, because they destroyed the wreck. But when it tore off the wheelhouse, it left the helm stand sitting up on top of the deck. And I guess they were trying to repair or fix it in somehow or another, because the wooden wheel was laying down on the deck. When I got there, I didn't see any wheelhouse. I went down inside, and there was one of those one-armed helms, right? You're familiar with those, Ron, back there? What do they call that? The one-armed helm, steering tiller. It was pneumatic, and I said, "This is not the kind of helm I want. I want one with a big wheel and whatever." But I did notice that there were a bunch of portholes, like all inside the wreck, and there was a box of snap-on tools. And I opened up the drawer, and there are all these ratchets and snap-on tools, and I proceeded to unbolt like a half a dozen portholes. And I took my tools that I didn't have, and I threw everything out in the sand and came up with thousands of dollars worth of snap-on tools and a bunch of portholes. It was pretty exciting. John goes down, he bypasses where the helm was. He actually looked at the helm, and he looked at it and picked it up, and he said, "Good job, Gene." And then he laid it back down. He thought I was underneath unbolting the helm stand, but I wasn't. So he left it. Jimmy Brown's brother, the mate on the boat, first time in the ocean ever diving, swims down and sees this wheel laying on the deck, takes his horse collar BC off, ties it to it, and sends it up to the surface, drops his weight belt and floats up to the surface and says, I'm done diving for the rest of my life. This is the best thing I've ever done. And that was it. Well, John goes down, he finds a name board which says William R. Farrell on it. And he figures that if he just lets it go, it's floating. Everybody on the surface will see it. Well, they did, but it was floating name down. And it drifted off, and we never saw it again. So here we are standing on top of the wheelhouse looking for the nameplate, that name board that we never saw. In 1978, I missed the dive. I was kind of lucky and not lucky, but there was a barge, tug and tow. They were coming up to past Point Pleasant, and the sea lion was anchored on the brunette, and the barge ran over top of the sea lion, crashed into it while divers were in the water. Carl Fenton saw the barge coming, so he went up with an axe and cut the anchor line with an axe just before the barge hit, and it pushed off. The anchor line sank back down to the bottom. Of course, George was diving, and so was John Dudas, and they all sank back down to the bottom, and they were like perplexed. What's going on? They came up to the surface. The boat was about 100 yards back behind the wreck, and George swam back to the boat, and he looked at Carl, and in a blaming way, he looked at Carl and he said, "Carl, what did you do?" He didn't realize that he actually saved the boat. Anyhow, they ended up having a crashed-in bow, and George had to get rid of the boat. Soon after that, he bought a new boat. But in the meantime, we had this boat come down, and we took the Ark, went out with Danny from down south in North Carolina, and went out and dove a bunch of wrecks with George that winter. The Algol is one of the biggest wrecks off the coast. It's an artificial reef. And the sea lion went out there. Kevin Brennan actually ran the trip out. George wasn't able to make it that day. He went out and saw the sinking of the Algol. And then this was a pretty exciting day. This guy goes down, and he finds a little plaque, and here it's a builder's plaque from the oil wreck. So a lot of firsts, a lot of discoveries, and a lot of great dives. Here's a guy here you might know, right? Sitting in the back, there's Tommy Fagan. Oh, here he is.
Sitting in the back of you.
Sitting in the back of me. Anyhow, there's Tom Fagan with the helm he recovered from the Arundo. So this is one of George's favorite wrecks. The first time he went there were pipes laying all over top of it and all these green bottles. And they were so excited, they decided that this wreck is all green because of the brass pipes and the brass bottles. Literally, I saw a film by Smokey Roberts, and there were like piles of bottles on the bottom, literally piles of bottles. And over the years, hundreds and hundreds of those ginger ale bottles have come up, but not really sure what it is. But about a dozen different types of ginger ale bottles have come up off of this wreck. This is another drawing, exciting drawing here by Greg Modell. The first drawing of the Delaware was by him, and this is a drawing also by Greg Modell of the Emerald Wreck. We think it's probably the hibiscus because it's missing a prop, which in the sinking of the hibiscus, that's exactly what happened. But there were 3 wrecks from 1873 that all went down in the same area. So it's really not exactly determined yet. Could be the hibiscus, could be the Francis Wright, or it could be the Alex Oldham. Buttons, and you find all kinds of buttons on it. The Mohawk sank Thursday, 1935, another one of George's favorite wrecks. He mined this wreck. We go out with dredges and pumps and scooters and dig, and found pepper shakers, which are pretty exciting. Here's a picture of Dave Culler with a bunch of pepper shakers. And there's Tom Fagan again. Where's Tom? Oh, there he is. And dishes. And it just had a great cargo. We did this for months and months and months. So when George passed away in 1997, we put his ashes on the Mohawk because it was one of his most popular dives. This is from the Mohawk, and there's Joni. And this is if you saw this slide before, I have to say this. Don't bring up a porthole too fast because it might get bent. See the porthole bent? Okay. But George was just a good time on the water. I remember at his memorial, one of his dive friends stood up and said, the best thing about George, he was just fun to be out there with. He was fun all the time, really a good time, making hundreds of people feel like they were his best friend, always. And later on, we went out and discovered more wrecks. These are his two mates together. It's a pretty unique experience. There's Stevie Sharon and Carl Fenton, who was his mate for about 20 plus years. And lots of, the boat was a little jammed in the back. If you got there early, you were like a loser because your tanks were pinned in by everybody else's tanks. So it was good to show up a little bit late. You got there late, then you could put your tanks in front of everybody else's tanks, and you kind of got your spot on the boat. So Cape May is very exciting, and here's a picture of Atlantic Divers Charter with two boats that came down. The Sea Line came all the way from Brielle to go to Cape May, and then the Down Deep, which I spoke about in the last presentation, off of Cape May. Okay, so there's other legends here too that went out, and this is the White Stars. So it's not just White Star, it's White Stars. There were four of them. Ray Adel out of Barnegat Light ran several trips for the dive shop in New Jersey and for Atlantic Divers in its first couple of years. He had some really premier boats. We went out to different wrecks like the Texas Tower, the Northern Lillian, and we did the first overnight trip on his boat down off of Cape May, and we hit the Big Seven, which is the Jacob Jones, the Moonstone, the Voslavs, the City of Athens, the Barringer, and the Northern Pacific, and the gunboat. So I remember all seven of them. And we brought a compressor. We went down to Cape May and ran this boat out. It was an exciting trip. About 20 plus portholes came up from the trip. On a night dive, we dove the gunboat, and I can remember all the lift bags in the water with the divers hanging on them and the bioluminescence, and all the divers just hanging there and all the bioluminescence just blasting off of them as they did. It was one of the best trips ever that I've done in my whole life of diving. Because it was so exciting. It was the first time that we went offshore and stayed overnight for 3 or 4 days in a row and did these trips. They were beautiful boats. Artie Kirshner, there's Bart Malone and me up in the bow, another resort trip. And there's Joni with the cage light. That's a much lighter cage light than the 400-pound cage light. And this is Mike DeCamp. He went out and he said, yeah, take my picture. So I went down and took pictures of Mike DeCamp. Mike DeCamp is the grandfather of wreck diving. Chuck Wine and me. And this is a dive schedule from 1981. Look at all the dives that we did weekly. We had, these boats took like 12 to 20 plus divers, and they were always full, and there was always a waiting list for these dives. They were still exciting. You say the wrecks were bigger and there was a lot more, but there were tons of lobsters. People used to bring garbage cans, and they would put their lobsters in the garbage cans and fill the garbage cans up. And these guys are legends because they went there first. So Sal Arena went out to all these deep wrecks. He's really known for taking people out to the San Diego and the Oregon out of Freeport, Long Island. I ended up doing a bunch of dives with him and mated for him on Mondays. And it was an agonizing trip. If you can imagine going up to Freeport, Long Island from Barnegat Light. I would dive the White Star on a Sunday, and then I would go up to Freeport, Long Island, and my day off, and I would dive on Mondays. So the traffic came to a standstill on the Belt Parkway, and you just sit there and wait and wait and wait, and finally you would get there late at night, which was like a routine for me, but I got used to it. The trip here, Bill Nagel, before he had the Seeker, or before had the first Seeker, he's very familiar for all the people that do a lot of diving. The Seeker was one of the most well-known or renowned boats off the coast for going out and finding wrecks. And that's Kathy Warehouse, and this is a helm from the Coimbra. Of course, the Andrea Doria was a big attraction, and Sal Arena was the first one to take divers out there in the 70s. So this is what they call Gary's second trip. First trip to the Andrea Doria was in 67, and then in 74, he decided to take another trip. And then it wasn't until 1981, 82, where he took out another group of people, and I happened to be able to go on that second trip. Oh yeah, this is another well-organized mess in the back of the boat. This is before the first dive. No, this is on the way in. We had a little 45-foot boat. The lifeboats on the Andrea Doria were 45-foot long, and this boat was, I think, 44 feet. So this was smaller than a lifeboat on the Andrea Doria. There were so many tanks, we wanted to get in 4 dives. So we took plywood and we put it across the bow section of the boat down below. We stacked all our tanks in there, and then we took plywood and put it on top and laid our sleeping bags on it, and we'd go to sleep on top of those tanks. When you had to get a tank, you take your empty set, you go down below, you lift up the plywood, you'd find your tanks, and you would pull out a set of tanks and then start all over again. It was a long process. There's no compressor on board, and on the way out, it was like 100 degrees in the boat because it was July. And you'd hear like a burst disc going off. And you were like, hoping it's the other guy's tank. It's not your tank. Well recognized as the premier wreck off the coast as far as the Mount Everest of diving, the Andrea Doria. Kathy Warehouse was the third woman to dive the Andrea Doria. Before that, it was Evelyn Dudas and then Janet Beezer on the another dive. There's the back of the boat. And that's a third of our tanks. The rest are all down below in the forward cabin. The Ile-de-France came to the rescue of the Andrea Doria. The Andrea Doria is the bow section there. Great picture of coming in for docking in New York. And this is what the Stockholm looked like. A big mess. The bow of Stockholm broke off and is near the Andrea Doria, and just recently it was dived. Again, this is like halfway through the trip. We're still pretty organized here. But you can see the guy with that's a guy named Pink, and he's got a can of beans, which is, this is gourmet cooking out there on the boat. So at the time, I got to digress a little bit again. We had this thing called a microwave, and we weren't really familiar with the microwave back then. There were no directions. Sal put it on the boat, and he goes, "You can run this when I turn the generator on. You can cook your food on it." So John Moyer and I said, "Oh, well, great." So we we wrapped up all this pre-cooked food, and we're just going to heat it up and put it in there in aluminum foil like you're supposed to do. Fired up the generator and hit the switch on the microwave. And all of a sudden there was smoke and a bolt of lightning coming out of this thing. And Sal came down screaming and yelling and says, "What are you guys, idiots?" I'm like, "We never saw one of these things before." I said, "Is it cooking or what?" He said, "Turn it off, turn it off." This is a surface interval entertainment here. We got Art Kirshner here with the 45 shooting targets in the water, 200 miles offshore, and not a very good shot, luckily. That's the new Sea Hunter. We had some pretty exciting trips there. I do have a presentation solely on the Andrea Dory, but I just wanted to talk about those that went ahead of us and blazed these trails. And there's some of the tanks that were in that little boat. And then we have the Seeker. There's Bill Nagel, John Chatterton, and Danny Crowell ended up being captains for this boat. And it's Bill Nagel in the Wheelhouse. It was a beautiful boat. He had it remade down in North Carolina. And there's Chuck Wine. He had a little boat before that. It was a Maine coaster. And he decided to get the Seeker. So he started out and bought the boat for like $500,000 and had it all redone. And by the time he was done, it was like another $300,000 invested in this boat. It was a beautiful boat, but I don't think he ever got his money out of it. There's Bart and Kevin England. And just some pictures of the boat in the dock at Montauk and also up. Gary Gentile, Tom Packer, Steve Gatto, and a couple of Atlantic Divers trips. We did 6 or 5 trips out to the Andrea Dory on the Seeker. And this is probably one of the premier dives that I did. We went out on the Wahoo, and we found these. There were 2 1,000-pound mosaic friezes from inside the Andrea Doria. They were pulled up and put on the back of the boat. There's a whole tale of these, of what happened there, but this is the crew that went out with us to get it. Sponsored by John Moyer completely. All right, so this guy here also investigated a lot of wrecks off the coast and should be known for what he did. Bob Archibald just passed away actually this past year, but was a finder and also had a little dive shop called the Old Porthole that was in Manasquan or Manahawkin? Yeah, Manahawkin, right? But the bite event, 56-mile wreck, the Texel, he found it. We were part of going out and looking for that. We did a lot of trips offshore to the Shookus, and we did a lot of inshore trips, just some fun trips. There's a Barringer, Northern Pacific Barringer trip that we did, running all the way from Barringer Light all the way down to the Barringer is a pretty good run, but this little crew boat could do it. The 2 guys on the right there, you know, the Barringer still seeps this oil. So they found something pretty exciting, and they decided that they would go up in the top of the wreck and feel around, and they got all coated with this bunker oil grease. So they're lathering up there with some soap at the end of the dive to try and get that bunker oil grease off. We had another experience on Sal's boat where Rick Jason and Jeff Pagano went down inside and undogged a porthole, and Rick Jason stood up on top with his light and shone it down inside the porthole so that Jeff could undog and unbolt the porthole. Well, all the bunker oil came out, went right up in Rick's face and covered his mask. And when I came up the anchor line on the Coimbra, I saw these little tar prints on the anchor line as I made my ascent. When I got to the 20-foot stop, there was Rick Jason. He had these two little windshield wiper spots in his mask where he had pushed his fingers through so he could see out with the bunker wheel. Well, Sal made them take off everything in the water and put it in garbage bags on the surface before they got back into the boat. Finding the Texel was a pretty exciting event offshore near the Carolina. This is in 220 feet of water. Okay. And the most influential person that I've known in diving is this guy here, Gary Gentile. You should be familiar with him. If you're not, just go to Wikipedia and look him up. I took this excerpt in here from Wikipedia that I'll show you, but this is my kind of like my knowing Gary look. He's always reading everything. So if he's not writing, he's reading. I met Gary through the dive shop in New Jersey with Norman back in 1974. I was working in the dive shop in the back room, and Norman came back and he said, put these tanks together and as doubles. So I started putting all these tanks together. I said, is this a club? Because there were 8 sets of doubles. He goes, no, some crazy guy named Gary Gentile. He wants to dive the Andrea Doria and he needs all these tanks. So that's how I ended up meeting him. But this is directly from Wikipedia. He's considered the world's best wreck diver, and glad to have him as one of my good friends, and learned a lot from him over the years. Went on to so many expeditions with him. He was an eye-opener. He introduced me to Nova Scotia, and we went up there and spent years diving in Nova Scotia, and I made 30-some plus trips, week-long trips up to Nova Scotia because of this guy. Went out on the Andrea Doria and dove so many different wrecks that I wouldn't have had the experience or the excitement to do. This proves that you can eat a banana on the boat and still have good luck. So otherwise there wouldn't be all these banana boats that run up and down the coast. I think that's a big myth, because here's Gary eating a banana on the boat. This is on the Monitor. Of course, it took 7 years of legal battles for Gary to get the privilege to go out and dive the Monitor, and we dove it on July 4th, 1990. I was glad to be a part of the crew and safety diver. And they're reviewing the plans there. There's Greg Massey, Gary Gentile, Bart, myself, and Art Kirshner. Roger Huffman is holding a ball that was on the surface, and while we were getting ready to go in the water, a shark came along and took a bite out of it. So, I mean, you have like the current, you're out there in the middle of nowhere, it's 240 feet of water, and you're getting ready to make your dive, and some shark comes along and just eats your dive line. There's Billy Deans on a scooter cruising around. So anyhow, if you get a chance, everybody who is a diver knows that Gary's written all these prolific books about wreck diving from Florida all the way up into Maine and into Nova Scotia. There's a book or an encyclopedia of shipwreck information that you can get from Gary Gentile's books. He's written over 37 plus shipwreck books and written over 60 different types of books, adventure books, including canoeing and biking now. He lives up in Jim Thorpe, and he's doing a lot of biking trails and river rafting, and he's an adventurer. We're born on the same day, 10 years apart, and I always kid Gary that the second model is always a little bit better and whatever. But anyhow, he was injured in Vietnam. He took a bullet just above his heart, and it blew out his lung, and he had his Achilles tendon shot, And he was in the hospital for almost a year and a half before he survived that. And he had a bullet go to his hip and take his hip off. So he's really a character. You can imagine he's done all these dives and adventures with half a lung and half a leg. So it's impressive that anybody could do something like that. Of course, my joke always with him is he always does things a little half-ass. So. This is Cape May. These are our two boats side by side in Cape May with Atlantic Divers, the RV Explorer. That'll be part 3 is modern times. These are old times here pictures, but I went all the way up until like the 1990s. The next chapter that I'll do on Reaching Deep is going to be from 2000 on. It'll be some of the wrecks that we've discovered with these new boats. Still some exciting adventures that we've done. And if I didn't give you credit for your picture, you get credit for your picture. I'm telling you now. Try to remember everybody who's in there who took pictures, especially Paul Whitaker here and Tom Fagan. I know there's a couple pictures. And Joni took some pictures too, and probably Steve sitting there. But
Greg Modell's.
And Greg Modell in the back there too. If I forgot you, hope I haven't offended anybody, just letting you know. That's it. If you have any questions, I'm up here, but that's all I have for you tonight.